I can see the count coming in. We had 40. Wait a bit more. Give it a minute and then I will start, just to make sure it's still counting. Okay, welcome. My name is Roehr. I'm an associate professor at SALA in the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture and the Landscape Architecture Department. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our new series called Tangents. Before I start, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that SALA is located and we are speaking today from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, Tsleil-Waututh nations. We further acknowledge those traditional territories of peoples wherever you are participating today. Welcome. Before we introduce our illustrious speakers today, I would like to just briefly tell you a little bit about Tangents. We have 3 sessions of Tangents. The first one today, which is orchestrated by Selina, Chau, and me, or emceed. And then we have another one, and that is called Scaling. And then we have another one called Linking, which is on the 21st of October, which is run by my colleague Leslie Van Duzer. And we have Switching on the 18th of November, which is run by my colleague Thina Tuck. We have the following speakers today, and I will start with ladies first. We have Dana Salama, when we have Chad Melanie, and we have Derrick Lee. So I would like to welcome them all, but I will give you a little bit of background about all 3. All 3 are alumni of our wonderful SALA school. And I will start with Dana. Dana graduated in 2019 recently. She actually did some work with me as well. And since she left, she founded the first Canadian chapter of the Architecture in Toronto in order to explore the nations of public interest and labor rights in architecture, with a special focus on decolonization development and promoting alternative modes of practice. She's currently based between North and West Africa, where she is an associate at Aziza's Chau projects, if I pronounce this right, developing conservation management plans for modern heritage sites in the global South, as well as a socially sustainable ecotourism and cultural projects using collaborative design tools. Throughout this work, this group, they have received grants from the Getty Conservation Institute, World Monuments Fund, and Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation, and others. The second person on the panel is Chad Manley. He also holds a degree from our school, both by the way so far in architecture. And he also has a bachelor degree in environmental planning from Dalhousie before that, and then did his master's with us in architecture. And he also received the outstanding prize for his thesis for his graduate work. He's also currently a candidate who is currently specializing to be a professional in the certification of ecological restoration from the University of Victoria. And what is also really interesting, outside his designing, he runs a small nursery where he grows and tests and propagates diverse collections of plants for the use of landscape practice. Wonderful. And he also is interested in understanding how these plants can be used for adapting to climate change and the issues we have currently. Chad also is an adjunct professor and guest lecturer at UBC regularly, and is an intern architect with the Architecture Institute of British Columbia and an associate of the British Columbia Society of Landscape Architects and a member of the American Fern Society. So welcome, Chad. And finally, and that I know in my head is Derrick Lee. He's an alumni of the landscape architecture program in the 90s. And he has been over the years an adjunct professor with us many times, but he's also one of the principals of PWL, one of the most biggest firms in Canada in landscape architecture, which resides here in Vancouver. And he is also instrumental in a lot of the bigger projects they are running there. For example, the Olympic Village waterfront, where he was one of the key designers of that project. One of his major talents, which is widely published, is his hand drawing skills. Even when I had not been appointed a professor, before I came to Vancouver, I picked up this book in Berlin one day, and there was Derrick's drawings in there. So his work is very prolific and very recognizable. And over the years, he's been often also a guest reviewer, also in my program and my colleagues' programs. But this year, he's also an adjunct professor, co-teaching with my colleague, Patrick Condon, in the urban design program. So welcome, Derrick. Thank you for joining us. And finally, I have only one sentence to say about what for me scaling is, and then I will hand it over to Selina. And that is, for me, scaling means you are expanding the field. And the reason why we chose you three is, as I've already alluded to, partially it could be in scale, but it could also be by expanding the profession to look at other directions, how the profession could have an impact globally on society and the environment. So I leave it with that. And Selina, I hand it to you. Thank you for joining us all.
Thank you, Daniel. And just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Selina, and I'm in the Mark Club program. I'm in my final year, and I found myself here in this dual program in architecture and landscape architecture because of my interest in understanding relationships and systems across different scales, especially in the urban realm. But when I think of scaling, one of the first things that comes to mind is Eames's Power of 10 film, often introduced in architecture courses that depict physical scales. And it makes me think about the many disciplines dedicated to exploring very different scales of perhaps the same thing. And as students in architecture and landscape architecture, we work with sites of various scales and design with consideration of regional systems, human scale experiences, as well as material and construction detailing. So I'm curious as to what our guests today have interpreted today's topic of scaling and how it might frame their work. So we'll begin.
So we can begin with your presentations. So maybe we start with Dana, then Chad, and then Derrick.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay. So hi, everyone. I only graduated from the MArch program in 2019. So my interests and my career are still very much evolving. But building off the theme, I'm going to share with you some experiences that are shaping my approach to the architecture industry in a very tangential manner. And I think the way I'm interpreting scaling is that I've always sort of been interested in the same themes, but as I sort of, as I sort of work my way through the industry, they maybe take on a few different scales and forms. So I pursued a Bachelor of Architectural Science, then I jumped around working in the art and architecture worlds. Although in architecture, I worked primarily at a public housing firm that did institutional adaptive reuse projects as well. And then I decided to go to grad school because although I was interested in the work I was doing, I constantly had to navigate bureaucratic quagmires and fee structures that I felt diluted the social impact of these projects. And I hope that SALA would provide an outlet where I could explore some of the lingering questions I had around architectural production. I quickly realized that SALA as an institution was malleable enough that we could explore whatever we were interested in. And during my time at SALA, I became the first or second outreach coordinator at FAFA for feminist architecture. And then together with my friends Olivia and Rebecca, we designed and curated the first year-end salon exhibition. My MArch thesis explored political discrepancies between the world's technocrats and those who are impacted by their decisions through 4 speculative fictions at different altitudes in supersurface space. And I was able to think through how architectural objects interacted with various spheres of geopolitical influence. In retrospect, my thesis, as well as some of the exhibition design and advocacy I pursued before and during and after SALA, were directly tied to my frustrations around the types of production that mainstream architecture encouraged. Post-graduation, I took an extended break and traveled from my hometown in Cairo across Europe and North Africa, looking for a different direction. I was captivated by one of the last places I discovered, which was this decommissioned brutalist thermal bath station outside of Fez in Morocco. And I found that Aziza Chau, a Moroccan architect who teaches at the Daniels faculty at U of T, was working on a conservation management plan for the site in collaboration with the local community. I ended up reaching out to her to grab a coffee back in Toronto, and we found that our values were really well aligned. And I basically was hired by the end of the meeting, and that's kind of where I'm still at now. So at Aziza Chau projects, we use collaborative design methods to create adaptive reuse strategies and conservation management plans for decommissioned heritage sites around Africa and other places in the global south, mostly focused on modern heritage sites that were commissioned or constructed in the early post-colonial period. This involves a lot of deep research and work with communities to redefine their relationships to the land and their own history, environment, and political systems. We also work with NGOs and individuals in remote communities to design, manage, and implement socially sustainable ecotourism master plans, yeah, I guess at the scale of cities, neighborhoods, and eco-regions. And so this is an image of a teenager we're working with who's also a collaborator on a project, which is a cultural center in the Roehr Valley, which is kind of in the Western Morocco desert. ACP's work is mostly financed by grants from governments or institutions such as the World Monuments Fund and the Getty Conservation Institute, although we're kind of hoping to move in a more crowdsourced direction. On a day-to-day basis, we jump scales pretty drastically. So one day I'm designing a board game for school children in Sierra Leone, And the next, I'm looking at a master plan of a large heritage complex and doing some research, or I'm curating a residency on site. Working with Aziza has showed me that sustainable architectural production that respects and works alongside grassroots efforts is slow, difficult to finance and implement, but ultimately possible. And that architects can redefine their relationships to the context they operate within to allow for more meaningful long-term relationships to develop. Prior to, or I guess simultaneous to starting at ACP, I was interested in exploring labor rights and alternative practice in architecture further. I co-founded the first Canadian chapter of the Architecture Lobby, which is an organization started by Peggy Deemer and others at the Yale School of Architecture. Today, there are chapters in 4 countries, and although each chapter sets its own agenda, we all adhere to a common manifesto that is centered around a recognition that despite architecture being a profession, it perpetuates unhealthy and precarious labor conditions. Many of these demands had actually led to my decision to seek an alternative form of practice post-graduation. And so they resonated with me pretty deeply. So at the Toronto chapter, we're focused on issues that impact our industry, our communities, and also the work we produce. We're a group of relatively young practitioners volunteering our time to think critically about the profession, often through a decolonial lens. Using a very sort of pluralistic organizational structure, we're sharing our sort of political experience, venting and building resources for ourselves and others to think differently about the role of the architecture industry in a Canadian context. So some of the questions we're answering are, how does our profession relate to the settler colonial state? What are the merits and setbacks of de-professionalizing architecture? Why is it illegal for architects to form unions in Canada? And what is our industry's relationship to labor organizing? Where is the research money in architecture going? Who is advocating for architects? How do we promote alternative practice and project structures that better support communities? So we had a series on Azura magazine where we reflected on these issues through written pieces and held online discussion groups to dissect them further. The first was what is public interest? The second was architecture on colonial land. And the third was architects for housing education. Taltio has brought me full circle back to my pre-grad school existential crisis. But I've learned along the way that architects need better political education and that we complain too much without taking initiative to change the socio-political environment within the profession. And as a collective, we're finding a lot of other voices and groups within and sort of outside of the industry who think on a similar bandwidth. And it's created a lot of encouraging momentum. So I'll end on this. We've been working with Victor Temperano, who's the developer of nativeland.ca, Vancouver Artist-Run Center 221A, and ARCA, the Artist-Run Centers and Collective Conference, to build a participatory map that locates racist and colonial objects, areas, and events on the map of Canada. It encourages people to design and propose counter monuments that question and bring attention to the settler colonial state, as well as the technology of the map itself. In a few short weeks, we're going to announce a large sort of countrywide initiative to build up the map and encourage critical discourse around its technology. Taltio hopes that this will become a tool for architects and other practitioners operating in the built environment to engage with lived experience, and that it may have implications for what we build and how we build it. All of the tangents I've explored before, during, and after my time at SALA have led me to understand how flexible our skills as architects are, and how they can scale from project to project or context to context. And as I think critically about the role of architectural practice, I'm increasingly drawn to those projects that jump scales and contexts all the time. I find that the direct through line in my work so far is a political exploration around the role of architects that questions our relationships to wider communities. I've also learned the importance of bottom-up approaches that encourage equal ownership and knowledge transfers, as opposed to top-down architect-client relationships that tend to reinforce inequality. And at this relatively early stage in my career, I'm less interested in following existing organizational structures and standards within the profession, and I'm sort of more interested in engaging at the grassroots and trying to build something up from there. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Very comprehensive. Thank you very much. Chad, you are the next.
Thanks, Dana. That was super inspiring. Really appreciate that and look forward to diving into the work. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully everybody can see that. So I'm Chad. I run a small practice, and I often refer to some of the projects that I'm working on this bizarre little portmanteau name, Big Littles. And so that's what I'm calling this, this presentation. And I suppose what I mean by that is that they're often small constructions, small buildings, small landscapes, but they often have components within them that reach out beyond their actualities, beyond their kind of material conditions. They're imagined as little pieces in a bigger whole, bigger spaces, bigger systems, part of a larger history, or some kind of continuum of culture. And so in this way, they're part dreaming and kind of part reality, part material and part myth. So we can see them at their two extremes as material and dream, but really it's the kind of imaginary space between that makes the project, I think, ultimately what it is within our consciousness. So today I'm going to talk about 3 different Big Littles. And really all of them have to do with forests and my kind of obsession with trees. So pardon me on that. The first one is with my colleague, was developed and co-designed with my colleague, Daniel Irvin, for the Museum of Vancouver. And it's an exhibition really about our relationship to forests here in Vancouver, both from a kind of historical and also a projective sense. So it's looking at the way in which we model our image through forests. And what I mean by that is we move with them, we build with them, we eat from them, we mow them down in order to eat from the land that they created and the soil that they stewarded. We build our homes with them and around them, and they are permeating the land and water that we rely on. And they also support the economy that we sort of live within. So these 5 components, as you see in front of you, are kind of these little dreams. They're forest emissaries, as we call them, talking toads, these kind of amphibious creatures, which are sort of between worlds, or cultural embodiments. So one instance of these, one station, one talking toad within the 5 is this home station. And it really can be seen as a creature of a mongrel state. It's chimeric. It is at once a kind of carapace of the development industry, casting away this this shell of formwork. At another stride, it's this kind of big stump that is giving life to species that come into it, as you would see in Stanley Park, something like that. A lattice, a bridge, a branch for animals, artifacts, and these cultural objects to sit within. And it's also a set of windows to sort of frame different cultural views about how we build homes through the structure of a forest. And so, for instance, there's this little Shinto shrine, which is a kind of intimation of this hidden Japanese community up behind Capilano College that was there previous to the Second World War. And just adjacent to it is this kind of digital well, a screen that we can kind of peer into the future. And just picking up on mapping and what Dana was saying before, the curatorial approach was to have a map within this body. And after a series of kind of amazing discussions that Danielle and I had with representatives from the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, it was quite clear that a map was not appropriate, and that we really kind of collectively imagined a different dream for this digital space. And that became an animated film, which is still under development. But it started to speak to a radical scale of past, all the way from the last Wisconsin glaciation, all the way to reconciliation and dreams beyond that. And what was, I think, you know, kind of super interesting for us is that it really wasn't a depictive exercise entirely. It was really about breathing life through metaphor. And so that these different moments, scenes, we call them seasonal rounds and so forth, were really kind of animated and came to life, not through literal translations, but as dreamscapes. And I'm just going to show you one tiny little image of that. I'm going to stop sharing, start sharing again. This clip before you, hopefully you can see, is about the titular or kind of cedar, which came into Coast Salish territory around 6,000 years ago, growing from a wet area that supports it. And share screen again, excuse me. So the next project is a house. It's a house again with Daniel, and it really came into being through the concept of from life and death in the forests. And so I'm going to show you another clip. I'm going to stop this again. Sorry, awkward moments. Share another video. Optimize for sound. So that model represents if you can imagine, a forest fire comes through and starts to burn and hollow out an old tree, and that tree under its own weight collapses. But within those hollows and within the structure, the fiber of that tree becomes a whole other set of life, a set of organisms which start to live in it, make it their own. I just wanted to acknowledge that a dear friend, Sam Oster, helped me with that model too, and he did an amazing job. But the kind of the way in which this common forest life or death scenario of trees falling to the ground and then resurrecting as new life is one I think that the architectural program can somehow find a way into. And as it falls to the forest floor, it comes on this 3.86 degree slope that we found at our site. And really that oblique opportunity, I think, gives the human body a different way of relating to the land than if we had just cleared it, flattened it, and brought back the horizon, which really isn't there. The horizon is the oblique in the case of the forest. So the resulting spatial conditions are more indeterminate. They're oblique, they're casting away, they fall, and these hollows become courtyards, they become hallways, they become rooms, terraces, which light can start to flow through. And so you're always kind of in relation to this oblique, this organic, without being cast away into a distant horizon, which is, I think, the kind of typical sense of what architecture should do. The last project I'm going to talk about is really about climate migration. It's about looking at the non-human world and looking at the climate migrants that are undoubtedly a part of the future going forward. And just like you saw in the previous slides, the Western red cedar temperate rainforest is this incredible condition on the West Coast, but it's increasingly a kind of remnant, and it's being pushed by climate change into very high levels of stress in terms of heat and drought. Yet it's a keystone. It's a keystone of 6,000 years of incredible material culture on the West Coast within Coast Salish territory. Yet we find also a Garryoak ecosystem, another cultural system, an ecosystem, and the camas along with it, the bulb, as on the other extreme, with a kind of tree system and meadow system, which is adapted to dry conditions, to warmth, to lowland areas, which can be kind of baked and cooked away. And in fact, they require fire. And if you look at the little graph here to the left, these oscillations and waves show the ways in which, as temperature over the past 6,000 years has fallen and risen, it's given rise both to oak culture and to camas culture, and also to cedar. And so these oscillations kind of provide through paleoecology and paleobotany perhaps a kind of gauzy roadmap forward. They say that, you know what, okay, things are going to get warmer, they're going to get drier, there's more fire coming, but we also know that we have the species as they migrate to help us through that. And so forests change, they move, they shift, they're plastic, but with this rate of climate change, we find that we may have to help them. And the way in which an oak grows and the system and the kind of species that come with it, they live in the same places that we do, in the same places that we like. So if we look at the Cascade Corridor here, Cascadia Corridor, Vancouver, BC, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, where millions of people live, these are the same places that oaks will and can and might inhabit. And so we have to find a space for them. And so this project is about basically building up a kind of a nursery using the infrastructure that's left over. And at the same time as these species move forward, it's about looking inward in a kind of small way towards saying goodbye to things that are leaving, in case of the cedar. So if we look at a typical kind of highway system, there's actually this incredible resilience in it for adapting to new climates. It is mown in terms of the grass being cleared away and so forth. And oaks actually need that. They need to live in areas of high light, and all of the species that we can imagine trailing along with them as this kind of superorganism require that too. They require this disturbance. And so that's already built within. We have those systems of governance and of practice within our highway cultures. So we can see that a nursery might start to become a part of this. And if you think, for instance, this year, California is going through critical shortage of acorns for replanting, and we cast ourselves 30 years forward and looking to kind of replant our forests that might be dying due to climate change. We're going to have regional nurseries that can supply us with all of this genetic in situ material. And of course, people are part of this. So we can think about firekeeping, the rise of a culture between community groups, and you know, a kind of organization at a ground level that can follow the oak and be with it. So if that is the kind of big myth, and that is the brain part of the project, and the little myth and the little heart within this project is really, I think, where architecture comes in and where it's required. And that is by kind of looking back to where the cedar started here and what the cedar starts to gesture in terms of its leaving. And that might really come to be formed through a parting gift, an antibiotic, an antifungal kind of vessel, which the cedar has. This has this kind of incredible wood to wrap itself as a protective blanket around the acorn. So the acorn is dropped into this porous vessel. This vessel is plunged into the earth by the fire keepers who are coming to organize on the highway, and it becomes the next step in replanting. So we see the kind of this fire-imposed, fire-born acorn drop into the vessel. The next spring, it starts to rise up, it roots down, and eventually, I think it falls away. The cedar has now left, it's rotted. The oak comes up through it, so do the butterflies, the erythroniums, and the people who cared for them. So thanks very much. I'll send it over to Derrick.
Thank you, Chad. Great.
Thank you, Chad. That was very inspiring, and I think what really resonates is really your connectedness to the land, and how wood as a metaphor becomes something that really underscores this this life cycle that we all live in. And in terms of life cycles, I wanted to just reflect on life cycles of sorts in the scaling presentation, mine being sort of my experience over, I would say, the last 20 some odd years in this profession. And what I would say about that is that our profession, whether our design professions, whether it's architecture or landscape architecture, continuously evolve. And I remember when I graduated in 1998 from UBC, you know, this whole idea of resilience wasn't even in the lexicon, and sustainability was a new word at the time. And it is interesting to see how we've grown. I wanted to show you this slide because these are my two kids. This was taken a few years ago, and you know, I think it's sort of reflective of who I am as an individual, and who I hope my children become as individuals, in terms of creatively inheriting our world, and thinking about how we inherit our world through sort of a playful lens, a lens of exploration, a lens of creativity, and this idea of drawing and sketching as sort of a continuum of ideas flowing from our imaginations onto a surface. And that is, you know, really important, especially for someone like me who grew up in North Vancouver. This was my suburban life, that in spite of being in sort of a suburban environment, you know, I'd always had this innate connection to nature and its processes. You know, this was Lynn Valley, this is Lynn Canyon. And, you know, the idea that I was able to step out from my backyard and be near this kind of environment was something that I felt was very special and very unique, especially within the the place that we live here in the Lower Mainland. At the same time, I was also a product of the 1980s generation. And this was a generation that was very much of a consumer generation, and we were very much born out of the boomer generation, which was an emerging consumer generation during the 1980s. And what was interesting about this generation that I grew up in was that I found myself at the sort of the confluence of connectedness with the natural environment, but also connectedness with a very synthetic environment, a creative environment, but a synthetic environment that was a representation of how we could assemble our future. And, you know, that sort of manifested itself in physical form with snap together modular components like this, which formed much of my childhood, and also digital components such as this, where, you know, we begin to think about how we assemble our cities and how we plan in a virtual reality. And I know Daniel would love this because it is some sort of a macro axonometric, digitized and pixelized. But this is sort of a representation of the world that this duality in the world that we live in, both in the physical and increasingly the digital. By the same token, you know, I was an individual who loved to draw, and this is a representation of the type of drawing and sketching that I really enjoyed. And I think it was perhaps influenced by this desire to want to assemble and create a sense of order out of the environment that I grew up in, that sort of was a confluence between the urban and the suburban and the natural. And that idea of representation in plan form, architecturally, was really something that I sort of took on through the course of my learnings in landscape architecture and took into my career. So not to dwell necessarily on my academic career, because it was somewhat short-lived. It was 4 years at the School of Landscape Architecture. But as I graduated and as I was working through the course of those 4 years as well, I realized that humbly I was stepping into the workforce, into industry. And, you know, with that, there were certainly some big shoes to fill. This, interestingly enough, was one of my first projects that I had worked on. This is actually Movie World in Madrid, Spain. So I couldn't have told you that a year in advance with my course learnings from Patrick Condon and Doug Patterson and others, that I would be stepping into, once again, a synthetic world of representation. And for the first year of my career, this synthetic representation of placemaking, but in a very artificial and a very controlled and fabricated sense, really was different than the way I sort of experienced my own natural environment growing up. That being said, what was interesting about these kinds of synthetic and fabricated environments was that they were a very interesting study on placemaking, a term that was foreign to me at the time, but became much more in focus through the course of our careers through the decades. As I moved back to Vancouver in the early 2000s, I found myself working from inheriting this canvas of this urban landscape here in Vancouver. And at the time, I mean, you know, this was a brownfield site. This was a heavily industrial site, part of the False Creek Basin. Of course, the False Creek Basin has evolved over time from sort of a much larger wetland, twice the size of what it was. You know, it was the home of the Squamish Tsawela-tooth and Musqueam. There were middens here. This was the herring returned to the site from January through to March seasonally, and it all went away. And interestingly enough, when we inherited this site, and we're privileged to be doing some of the early planning on it. It was about creating that sense of memory, transforming what was an intensively industrial site that left a legacy, both through a negative environmental footprint to a curious sort of historical overlay that became something that we began to look at in our planning. And so, you know, it was about planning for everything above the ground, but it was also about planning for everything underground. And so this idea that our connectedness to the land exists this way. And in terms of how we began to, in early days, you know, envision green infrastructure, envision placemaking and well-scaled public spaces, all began to sort of harmonize on this project. You know, being able to understand a different form and scale than what typically Vancouver was characterized by, with the tower podium concepts of the downtown peninsula. And at the same time, it was about creating these metaphors. And so this was an early sketch of Canoe Bridge, which was a real interesting collaboration with the city in terms of celebrating non-motorized marine transportation, you know, going back to the First Nations and pre-colonial sense, but doing it in a way that created this sense of sort of the backbone or the spine, if you will, of the waterfront. And so, you know, the metaphor of how a canoe is fabricated and how that becomes the cradle of movement, of active mobility along the waterfront was something that was a study. And also the importance of hand sketching and iterating ideas. And I wanted to show this because it really, through a lot of the exploration of hand drawing, we began to come up with a lot of the solutions that did in fact materialize on the site, whether it was handrails, whether it was drainage runnels, and the expression and the overlay of the natural and the industrial, and that sort of interplay of form that was overlaid. You know, and this was sort of the end product of that journey through early stages of conceptualization and the area planning of the site through to the details and interventions within the foreshore, and also the ecological interventions of bringing nature, whether it was the Habitat Island or Hinge Park wetland, into the fray, and being able to look at this metaphorically as a living and breathing organism. You know, that the wetlands were indeed the kidneys of this site, that the parks were the lungs of the site, and that the pedestrian movements and the seawall were really the lifeblood of human movement coursing through the veins of our urban landscape. And I'm going to just cycle through some of these slides fairly quickly here. But yeah, you know, this idea that we as human beings are connected to nature. We are indeed inseparable from it. And in our short period of colonialization, we've divorced ourselves from it. And this early project was a way for us to begin to sort of reconnect and you know, really kind of articulate that very interesting relationship between living in a highly urban environment, a highly dense environment, but being able to connect in a very intimate way across a very sharp and short transect, entering into what effectively is a reconstructed natural environment. You know, similarly, we've taken that approach and applied it in various locations around our urban landscape locally here. This is an image of East Fraser lands, where one could say this was sort of the next version of Southeast False Creek on a much larger scale, but embodied a lot of the qualities and characters of restoring the riverine landscape and creating an interplay of urban, sharp urban interfaces with the river's edge, but allowing the river to sort of invade or to inundate, if you will, the natural landscape or inundate the urban landscape as well. And, you know, this is just the idea that our region is densifying quite quickly. And, you know, the hope is that, you know, as we begin to live potentially in more vertical housing forms, there is a very strong risk that that leads to disconnectivity with the land. And so we're faced with that pressure, that upward pressure of urbanization that compels us to find more radical ways of reconnecting people to the landscape. As we move further east into New Westminster, this is a very interesting and curious landscape in that for decades, I mean, for the better half of the 20th century, through urbanization and through the advent of the automobile, that our human landscapes became very much disconnected from the water's edge. And so when you think about the CPR rail lines that have basically been strung across most of our waterfronts in urban landscapes, most of our cities, along rivers, along oceans, you know, that has been a big challenge. And how we were able to bridge that with bringing people back into a park landscape, which is about reconnecting the grid of streets and human movement patterns to the water's edge. And this was an earlier shot. This is probably about 10 years old, before much of the parkade had been taken down. But you know, this is a systematic increment of reconnecting the waterfront back into the urban fabric, and the subsidence of transportation mobility as a barrier, and utilizing landscape to really reconnect people to the water. And as artificial as it is, it's a very interesting, you know, I guess, connection to what could have existed, what did exist along the water's edge in times past, including the multiple layers from, you know, the ecological riparian ecologies to the industrial as represented in the grid of piles, and more recently to the more kinetic industrial elements of the you know, bridges and cranes that sort of dot the industrial waterfront landscape. And, you know, the idea of creating a sense of memory on the waterfront in terms of this structure as being a representation of the Lytton Square Market, which was the confluence of commerce along the waterfront for both colonial peoples and Aboriginal peoples, including the Kikite nation along the water that used to trade with in this very abundant fishery. And so creating that memory was not necessarily a literal representation, but it was a much more of a metaphorical reconstruction of utilizing the timbers and the forms that would have characterized this waterfront about 80 years or 100 years ago. And that sense of kinetic form, the sense that you can indeed interact with your environment and manipulate it. You know, these are some lounge chairs, what we call hinge loungers, that begin to mimic some of the kinetic crane elements that characterize the Fraser River. And the forest of piles, which indeed, if you stripped off this deck, remain underneath the water as sort of a grid, overlay of that memory of past industrial history. Interestingly enough, we stumble into the world of development, real estate development. And this is actually a very interesting conundrum for us, because, you know, how do we begin to reconcile, you know, our lives in a city here where the cost of living is increasing to unaffordable levels. And yet these projects, because of their size and scale, have been successful in being able to deliver high quality public spaces. This is something quite unique, because what this represents is a Not necessarily, it is a form of land reclamation. I would say it's a form of air parcel reclamation, of creating what is actually a public park. This is Ketchison Park, above a private development parkade below. And so this would have not been possible without the development to allow this to happen, and to allow the quality of spaces and the exploration of, I'll go back to this slide, representing the Richmond landscape in a curious way, ironically, as this being on sort of an elevated plateau due to the restrictions of excavation within a seismically unstable zone. And so this representation of the river landscape in a very artificial sense does sort of create this sense of the biophilic landscape. And you know, how do we begin to recreate that sense of nature on a parkade slab using artificial materials and forms, but in ways where there is this strong sense of memory and experience, particularly with children interacting with this landscape. As we move over the Salish Sea to Victoria, one of the projects we found ourselves in was this area known as Ship Point. And Ship Point was really a soft shoreline and an informal gathering and event space for the First Nations. And you know, over time, they became what was known as a working waterfront. And as we began to look at this highly complex site that basically had a whole number of activities, both industrial, tourism, event spaces, harbor air, and so forth, we had to work with stakeholder groups and the community to begin to disassemble and reassemble the ideas of this site into something that represented a working waterfront, and at the same time, a place, a civic destination.
Derrick, I don't want to interrupt, but you're going a little bit over time, so we must make sure, to be fair to the other panelists, that we don't have so many slides. So could you wrap it up like in 2
I will,
minutes,
absolutely.
so that the students can actually ask to all your wonderful presentation questions.
Okay.
That'd be fantastic.
I'll move on very quickly. So this, just as a quick slideshow, this was Granville Island, and I think that represents another very interesting confluence of uses, both industrial and cultural and environmental, that we were looking at for the 2040 vision, looking at infrastructure and trying to reconcile that with you know, how we can begin to heal this urban destination in the city of Vancouver. You know, as we begin to move into other areas, this is a very familiar phenomenon in Vancouver of the Tower Forest and the master plan. And so how we begin to utilize the urban landscape and landscape architecture to reconcile those types of spaces. Just very quickly, we have also been focused on the Columbia River as well. And much like the learnings along the Fraser River and the False Creek Basin, we've begun to look at how we can bring people to the waterfront in very creative ways that actually reinforce that sense of industrial memory and environmental sort of healing of the landscape and reconnecting people to the water's edge. So with that, I'm not going to get into provocations any more than saying it's about our city. And in this case, it's also about creating places for people and deconstructing our street grids and creating new places that don't focus on automobiles and look at the healing of this landscape. This being the Port of Vancouver site, which is probably one of the most complex sites in our nation. And this is a very interesting idea that we're actually looking at and leading with the values of the First Nations, the MST, to rethink how we can plan a major urban site now into the future. So I will leave it there. This is a picture of my son. And we hope that we can pass some of these legacies on to the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derrick. I think the best way to go forward is if you share the screen all together as a panel. I have a question here from a student, but maybe Selina, maybe you have a question you would like to start to ask the student.
Yeah, and I just wanted to start off to thank everyone for the presentations. It was so interesting to see the diversity of work and inspiring, because you all came from the same sort of master's or similar master's program, and to see sort of this course and profession evolve over time. You can see also your individual passions and your projects from politically driven to ecologically and culturally driven. So my question to start off is, what are your thoughts on traditional or mainstream skills that architecture works in, and what does it mean to work outside of it? And Dana, you mentioned de-professionalizing architecture, which I thought was very sort of provocative, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, and maybe everyone could sort of share their thoughts as well.
Sure. So the basic idea around de-professionalizing architecture is changing the way the profession is structured so that you don't need to have, or I mean, there's different ways to go around the argument. You could say it could be like more of an incremental licensure process, or you could deprofessionalize altogether and have sort of decentralized expertise within the profession. And the thinking behind that is that it removes some of the economic barriers or reduces some of the economic barriers to get into the profession. And also, because we are a profession in Canada, we're exempt from certain labor rights. So architectural interns don't have to get paid overtime, for example. We're also not allowed to form unions, and that sort of impacts our profession. That's like the basic tenets of deprofessionalization. In terms of like operating beyond mainstream architecture, the way I see that is you're sort of working on projects that don't adhere to the same fee structures, project phases, etc. And that like opens you up to a diversity of projects that you don't see in quote unquote mainstream architecture. But obviously there's sort of like overlaps that's not so clear cut.
I have another question here from Jordan, which I'm going to read to you guys. Do you think we will start using recyclable materials in architecture and move away from using the forces of nature, but instead totally mimicking it? Maybe this question goes to all three of you. Maybe Chad.
It's certainly possible at a smaller scale, and I think that's where, I mean, for instance, with the work at the Museum of Vancouver, they have a kind of mandate that has increased the amount of recycled materials that are streaming into their projects. And so they've worked with the City of Vancouver quite closely in terms of their building team and recycling resource centers to connect materials, you know, back and forth, and that's been successful so far. And I know the City of Vancouver and Metro Vancouver too have certainly made huge strides in terms of the way in which materials are recycled as things get torn down and then rebuilt. But I think part of it too is really about kind of relearning how to design as well. It's at a small scale. I know that I think I have to kind of be adaptable, and the concepts have to shift throughout the course of the project It is not about kind of stamping down a design as we know it. It's about adapting through the course of a process to kind of welcome in new materials that might not be the things that you automatically think to spec within the course of a project. So I think treating it in a way a little bit more like a gardener, where you're opening yourself up to the chance and circumstance of different, let's say, off perfect kind of materials and material ecologies.
Any other comments, Dana or Derrick, on this as well, before we go to the next question?
I would say that I think it's a very interesting time that we're entering into, because I know in our practice, it's always been a struggle to meaningfully work with recycled materials in mass in something that is indeed scalable to make a difference. And I think that one of the things that some of the breakthroughs are some of our most carbon intensive materials, and I'll give the example of concrete, for example, is one where, you know, the idea of carbon sequestering or re-injecting carbon into concrete, I think is going to be a profound game changer in terms of our constructability. And I would also say that the use of rapidly renewable materials, things like bamboo for decking and scaffolding and even timber structures, is very much beyond anything that we have here within BC in terms of renewable wood. And I think that's going to also be a big game changer in our industry.
Dana, any comment?
Building off of that, we often work in remote communities where it's not possible to import a lot of cement or concrete. And so, and also, like, from an ecological standpoint, we believe in sort of working with vernacular construction. But the interesting thing is that, like, in a lot of these places, through the generations, in an attempt to sort of like modernize their architecture, they've lost traditional knowledge on like vernacular construction practices. So often it's like a process of like rediscovering how to build with rammed earth with the community by like studying old buildings in the region. And so I think like this turn towards regionally and like ecologically appropriate construction methods isn't just happening in Vancouver, it's happening in like other more remote communities around the world.
Thank you, Dana. Selina, would you like to continue with the next question?
Yeah, so the next question in the Q&A is aimed towards Derrick. So the writer says, thank you for the great presentations. And Derrick, what advice would you give to someone looking to pivot from a career in urban planning and economic development to a career as a designer in landscape architecture?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think I would have had a very different answer 10 or 20 years ago. And I think it's something where the profession is changing radically. It's I would say landscape architecture is a profession that is continually defining itself in new ways and new directions. And I think even the idea of design is very different now because it takes on so many different forms. I mean, if I were to give you an answer 20 years ago, it would be, well, you know, go learn your, go work in a nursery, understand horticulture, and you know, understand your ecology and take your dendrology and go work on a farm for a while. But I think now it's different. I think that there's much more, there is all of that, absolutely, but there is much more of a systems-based perspective that is the confluence between urban planning, economic development, and landscape architecture in that, you know, where you begin to connect the dots between those two other subject areas, those two professional disciplines, it is what we're beginning to enter into now. So I think the gap is becoming less in terms of making that jump from these professions into this profession. And you can find those kind of relevant areas of expertise to push those boundaries of the profession.
Amazing, thank you.
Any more questions from the floor? Put them in the chat if you like. Selina, do you have another question?
Yeah. If, I guess for all the panelists, what would your advice be to a student who's interested in following a similar trajectory or career path as you, whether it be like you all have such diverse sort of work and projects, and based on your interest or our own interests, like if we had similar ideas of where we want to be, what would your advice be to SALA students?
I'll start off, or Derrick, do you want to go? Well, I mean, what am I, 10 years out of school? I started and I graduated directly with a project. It was actually a thesis project that I was working on. So I launched immediately into practice. And I think there's benefits to that if you leave school with a kind of direct focus. But the thing that I didn't get, and that I kind of wish I had, was more direct office experience. I've had to kind of bring other people into my office to learn from them, from their experiences being in a more professional setting. So I certainly think that, you know, moving around a lot, taking a risk, you know, situating yourself outside of the number kind of one place that you'd like to go is really important. Giving yourself those chances and knowing that there's certainly at the beginning of your career an opportunity to see the way in which many individual organizations offer different platforms for the study of design. So I think being a little bit like kind of footloose and fancy free with the way in which you start to apprentice is my advice, coming from someone who didn't do that at all.
Yeah, I would tend to echo Chad's perspective on that. I just speaking from experience, you know, I probably did maybe about an 18-month stint of as many places I could possibly work around the world until I finally came back to Vancouver. And even though that was such a short period of time, it was so almost a flash in the pan in many respects. They were some of the most memorable times where, you know, landscape architecture in Vancouver, I would still say was in its infancy in many respects, but being able to sort of see beyond that, you know, exposing yourself and your, you know, you're opening your horizons in other places, you were able to sort of bring that back. And so I would say, yeah, be footloose and fancy free. And then, you know, as you begin to move through your career, you sort of begin to build that stability as you begin to settle into areas that you feel comfortable with and you're passionate about. Be passionate. You can always be passionate. Find that in your career that you love.
Echoing both of those sentiments, I think it's good advice to just like work in a bunch of small-ish practices and get to do get to work on different typologies. But also I kind of learned from my undergrad where I felt like my interests didn't necessarily align with my program super well, that there is space for whatever you're interested in architecture. Like, it's such a diverse field. So like, stick to your guns and it'll eventually work itself out.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing all your personal experiences. We have one more question, sort of on a similar note in the Q&A. It says, what advice would you give to someone in grade 12 wanting to go into architecture?
Well, I'd follow a similar line and say, don't necessarily go into architecture. Go out before you go in. I mean, architecture accepts, I think as Dan was just saying, like this tremendous diversity. You're kind of omnivore in this field. And there's a richness to the world that I think is going to come back into your architectural education if you study chemistry or, social science or whatever it might be, philosophy. I think that's the kind of beauty of it. And architecture school in general is buoyed by that kind of diversity of all of these different people from different backgrounds coming together to think about the way in which we cohabitate. And so I think as a kind of profession, we're better off for there being both specialization and also this kind of, general interest across the board.
I can also maybe answer this question because I had a little cousin thinking about entering architecture this year. And my advice was like, go look at a bunch of architecture programs, sit in the studios, just kind of like shadow and figure out whether you actually like it or not. And then there are so many sort of allied fields you can start looking at too. But I think like trying to find a program where you're doing a bunch of, where you're engaging with a bunch of disciplines like beyond architecture too is really helpful.
On that note, as we have already gone quite over time, and I want to be mindful of all the times being on Zoom most of the day already, I would love to thank you three, Dana, Chad, and Derrick, for this is our first trial run of these 3 sessions. And I have to really say on behalf of SALA that it was amazing to see our alumni shine like this and to see how you took on scaling in all the different directions and to see your different ways of representing it and speaking about it. So I think it was fascinating. And I really appreciated all the hard work you put into these different presentations. And thank you very much from SALA and the student body as well, from us faculty and the students. So really appreciate this. So thank you very much. I wish I could invite you for a beer, but we will do this soon. Hopefully we can all meet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great to see you guys again.
Yeah.
Take good care, Chad and Dana. Good luck with everything. I see Derrick here on campus. Bye. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.